The hills of central Taiwan were never meant for outsiders. That truth clung to the air like the morning mist, thick and breathless, the kind that settled deep into the lungs and warned you with every inhale to turn back. But in the spring of 1852, 6 women defied that warning. They were not merchants, soldiers, or explorers, but nuns. Young, devout, and unwavering, they journeyed along the overgrown missionary trail with only a cart of provisions, crates of ink, rolls of parchment, and a quiet conviction that their suffering had purpose. Led by Sister Mei Hua, a woman of remarkable stillness and piercing gaze, they walked for 4 days under fogged sun and gray rain to reach the Luguo convent, a forgotten outpost once held by French Jesuits before the mountain swallowed it whole. What they found was not quite ruins, but not quite sanctuary either. The convent was carved from stone that looked ancient even in its youth, walls slick with moss, shutters nailed shut from inside, and a bell tower whose bell had not rung in over 10 years. No birds flew overhead. The grass, though green, bent as if from some invisible weight. The air around the chapel smelled faintly of wax and rust, and the silence that blanketed the grounds had a density that made even whispering feel disrespectful. Locals from the nearest village, more than 4 miles downriver, had spoken of the place as cursed. Some said a French priest had gone mad there. Others claimed it was once built atop a burial site older than the island's memory. But the bishop in Tainan had his reasons, religious, political, and administrative, for reviving Lugo. And Sister Mei Hua, chosen specifically for her calm resolve, was not one to be swayed by folklore or fear. With her companions, Sister Yun, Sister Li, Sister Chia, Sister An, and Sister Ru, they swept the convent's floors, scrubbed its chapel walls, and began their missio, Enen, to translate, transcribe, and communicate regularly with the diocese. Their first letter, dated June 3, 1852, was filled with gratitude. "The hills sing with silence," wrote Sister Yun, "and the wind speaks through the trees like a hymn." They wrote of their prayer cycles, of discovering a long hidden manuscript in the pulpit, and of rebuilding the herb garden once used for medicine. Sister Chia described waking to the sound of bells, though no one had rung them, and the comforting presence of something watching over us. But as the weeks wore on, a subtle shift crept into the pages. The second letter mentioned strange marks appearing on the walls of the scriptorium, symbols etched in black ash that none of them remembered drawing. By the fourth letter, Sister An had reported nightly dreams of being submerged in ink, hands unable to stop writing as her lungs filled with words. Sister Ru had developed a stutter, though she had never stuttered before. Sister Li grew pale and cold to the touch, even in the summer heat, and insisted on sleeping inside the chapel, claiming she could hear God humming from beneath the altar. By August, the tone of their reports darkened. One paragraph, penned by Mei Hua herself, calmly noted the occurrence of a lightless hour, when time inside the convent froze for exactly 13 minutes. The bell tolled, 13 times, though the rope was untouched. The nuns had been praying in the main hall, and none remembered finishing their prayer. When they checked the convent clock, the hands had spun backwards. That letter was stained with ink, even before it was packed for delivery. The next one arrived late, delivered not by courier but by a peasant boy who claimed he'd found it nailed to a tree near the river, sealed in wax and tied with black thread. That letter contained only 4 sentences. It began, "He listens when we do not speak." The "oh." There, 3 lines were written in mirror script, the last one smeared, as if the writer had suddenly flinched or dropped the quill. It took a scholar in Tainan nearly 2 weeks to decipher the mirrored text. There are verses in the silence. We did not know silence could sing. It is older than Scripture. Concerned but restrained by the politics of imperial oversight, the bishop ordered one final attempt to verify the convent's safety. He sent ink, paper, and provisions with the next courier, instructing the nuns to respond immediately upon receipt. They did. That letter, dated November 29th, was both longer and more lucid than expected. It detailed an incident during midnight prayer in which the air grew so heavy that all 6 nuns collapsed to the floor. Sister Chia claimed she heard the Virgin Mary speaking, not in comfort, but in warning. "Not all things that call themselves holy are," she wrote. Sister Yun had begun sleepwalking, waking each morning covered in ink and standing barefoot in the cellar. Sister Ru wept continuously, even when unconscious. Their final paragraph noted that the convent's ink supply, despite being nearly empty, had begun to refill itself, only at night, only in silence. They began calling it the Black Mercy. The bishop never received another letter. No courier returned. By December 1853, the Luguo convent was silent. Locals claimed they heard the bell toll again, once, then never again. Snow, rare for that region, fell quietly that year, muffling the ground around the chapel, sealing off the path like a shroud. No one dared return. And still, the trees around the convent remained bent, as if they too had bowed to something they could not name. It was January of 1854 when Father Anselmo was summoned, not by urgency, but by a strange absence, a vacuum in communication that the diocese could no longer ignore. Months had passed since the last letter arrived from Luguo convent, and the silence was no longer a delay but a warning. The bishop, a careful man not prone to panic, selected Anselme for his temperament. He was young but solemn, a scholar of scripture and folklore, someone who knew the weight of both prayer and myth. He departed from Tainan with a satchel of anointed oil, consecrated water, and a sheaf of blank scrolls prepared to retrieve words or bodies, whichever awaited. His only companion was a local tracker, an old Hakka man who had lived long enough to recognize cursed ground when he saw it. They traveled upriver under a dull gray sky, the trail muffled by winter dampness, leaves wet and slick beneath their feet, every sound swallowed by the thicket. The tracker would not enter the final stretch. He stopped 300 yards from the convent and simply pointed, his face pale, muttering, "The birds do not sing there. Even the wind walks around it." Anselm continued alone. As he approached the convent's crooked gate, he saw no footprints, no motion, just the twisted trees and the high stone walls that somehow seemed taller than described in the old reports. The bell tower loomed above, its spire coated in soot, the bell unmoving. He knocked once, then twice. No response. The heavy wooden doors, marked with a faint ash cross, were barred from within. He circled the perimeter, finding a broken window by the refectory. He entered through it, cutting his palm on a jagged edge but pressing on, barely noticing the blood. Inside he was struck by the stillness, not the kind one finds in a holy place, but something else, something manufactured, thick like molasses, the kind of quiet that didn't wait for prayer but dared it. Dust hovered mid-air yet never settled. The chapel was immaculate, candles fresh, pews aligned, though no human hand had touched them in weeks. Then he entered the scriptorium and saw them. 6 nuns, seated at their writing desks, heads slightly bowed, eyes wide open. They did not blink. They did not breathe. But they did not look dead. Not exactly. Their posture was too alive, too deliberate, their hands frozen in mid-stroke, each gripping a quill above parchment soaked with fresh ink. Some of the ink still glistened. It dripped slowly, as though time had slowed within those walls. Their faces held no terror, no sign of suffering, only intense concentration, like children listening to a story being whispered into their souls. Anselm stepped forward. He touched Sister Meihua's wrist. No pulse. Yet her fingers twitched slightly when he tried to take the quill from her hand. He recoiled. On the pages before them were lines of text written in a language that should not exist. The glyphs spiraled outward from the center of each page, curling like vines, some floating between the margins, others rising vertically up the parchment, as if gravity meant nothing to them. He did not recognize the characters. Not Latin, not Mandarin, not Church Aramaic, not even the esoteric codes of the early Gnostics. One of the pages began to ripple as if wind had passed through it, though the air was still. He gathered the letters carefully, placing them in his satchel, and then began to explore. In the chapel, he found a collection of candles arranged in a spiral around the pulpit. The altar cloth was stained with ink. On the wall behind the altar, scratched faintly into the stone, was a single phrase repeated over and over. He listens between the words. It was not signed. Following an impulse he did not fully understand, Anselm descended the back stairwell into the cellar, a place the original convent map had not marked. At the bottom he found a sealed door, bricked shut, coated in soot, and lined with 6 wax crosses, one for each nun. The air here tasted of metal and mildew. Though his hand shook, he peeled off the wax, whispered a psalm, and began to chip away the bricks. The passage opened with a long, shuddering breath. Beyond it lay a circular room, its walls lined with mirrors, old, tall, each framed in rotting wood. But the mirrors did not reflect him. He saw only the room, empty, even as he stood inside it. In the center sat a low altar or basin carved from stone, filled with thick black liquid. Ink, but not ordinary ink. It had a shimmer to it, like oil on water, yet darker, denser, and alive. As he stepped toward it, a low humming began, a vibration in his bones rather than in his ears. He dipped one finger into the ink. Instantly, the humming grew louder, and behind him, the mirrors began to fog. Then, from all sides, 6 voices, familiar yet not, began to chant in unison. They did not use Latin. They used no known tongue, But he understood. The words had no translation, yet he felt them inside his chest. In the pause between divine utterance, he waits. He dropped to his knees, weeping. That night, he could not sleep. He returned to the chapel and began writing feverishly, compulsively, as though a flood of knowledge poured through his hand, bypassing his mind entirely. He filled pages, dozens each, with the same alien script the nuns had used. The ink in his satchel never ran dry. He did not eat. He did not sleep. When the sun rose, he did not notice. The next day, he wrote again and again. On the third day, he sent a letter back to the bishop. Its content was brief. The silence is not absence, it is possession. The bishop responded with a demand to leave immediately, and Selm never replied. When the courier returned, he found the convent sealed once again. The bodies were gone. The writing desks were empty. The mirrors had shattered inward, their shards arranged in precise geometric patterns. Only the basin of ink remained, still undisturbed, still full. The church, panicked but discreet, issued an internal order. The site was to be locked, consecrated, and abandoned. In March 1855, under imperial edict, Luguo Convent was declared condemned due to structural instability. The bishop never spoke of it again. Anselmi's name was removed from the clergy register. But some say he was seen in the hills years later, Dayin, raped in black, carrying parchment that writhed when unrolled. Others claim he wandered into the sea, ink staining his palms even as the tide took him. Either way, the writing never stopped. And in the years that followed, travelers near the area claimed to hear scratching sounds, quills against parchment, carried on the wind long after the sun had set. The ink, they said, never dried. The silence of Luguo Convent stretched across nearly half a century like a veil pulled tight over the face of a forgotten corpse, untouched, unspoken, left to rot in memory even as the world around it changed. By the time the Japanese Empire assumed control of Taiwan, the land had begun its slow transformation into colonial inventory. Temples, shrines, estates, forests, and ruins were catalogued and measured by scholars and bureaucrats eager to prove dominion over both the living and the dead. It was during this surge of inspection and excavation that a group of university researchers from Tokyo, commissioned by the Imperial Institute of Ethnohistory, stumbled upon the convent, not on purpose, not with expectation, but by following a trail of unmarked paths etched into maps by a long-dead Jesuit missionary whose journal mentioned a chapel of impossible echoes. The Luguo convent did not appear on official records, but its outline, faint and trembling, existed in the margins of a missionary scrawl. The team, comprised of Professor Akihiro Sato, 2 linguists, a young Christian convert named Kojiro, and a translator fluent in Mandarin and Latin, arrived in the early spring of 1898. What they found made no rational sense. The building, though built nearly 50 years prior and abandoned without caretakers, had not decayed. The stone remained smooth, the wood unrotted, the windows unbroken, though thick vines now gripped its walls like skeletal hands pulling it down. Even more disturbing was the lack of dust, the floors swept clean, the candle holders free. Sato refused. On the 9th night, they unearthed a set of pages hidden inside the stone basin in the basement, pages that shimmered under moonlight and grew warm to the touch. That evening, the entire group heard what they described as the sound of 1,000 quills scribbling from within the walls. Professor Sato described the sensation in his notebook. It was not noise, it was presence, it was the weight of something writing us down. One by one, the members of the expedition began to unravel. Kaori left the site in the middle of the night and was found near the riverbank, her journal drowned, mouth filled with ink. The linguists refused to speak, drawing only spirals and prayer wheels. Kojiro vanished into the woods. Sato returned to Japan with 36 pages and the bound Journal of Skin, swearing never to speak publicly of what he saw. But his private life fell into ruin. His wife left him. He burned every page of his original field notes and tried to recreate the script from memory. Within a year, he developed what doctors described as a writing psychosis. He would fill walls, furniture, even his skin with symbols. He died in 1901, having clawed out his own tongue. Between 1900 and 1936, at least 11 other scholars who handled the Luguo manuscripts met similar fates. One linguist from Kyoto developed a compulsion to write letters to himself, addressed to the voice beneath the silence. A seminary historian died of cardiac arrest after attempting to translate a passage that spoke of the God of unwritten things. Another professor leapt into a furnace after claiming the script had begun writing back. The only surviving manuscript, now held under lock and triple glass casing in a restricted archive at National Taiwan University, is a single sheet containing a single line scrawled in spiraling black ink, documented by at least 5 archivists who refused to